So the critical mainstream has been focusing on the critique and not so much on this contextual variance. So I will review a few attempts to rectify this, and I will argue for an approach which follows up on these contextualist attempts to study security, while also bringing some new twists. So the main research question of my PhD research is how the question of belonging enacted in security practices of queer Georgians. So queer Georgians are people who live in a rather conservative religious society, which confronts them on everyday basis and often quite violently. And so they have to think about security a lot. And now I'm interested in how the effort to enhance one's feeling of security interweaves with this question of belonging. That is the question of where we and others belong, right? And in the sense, I'm interested in both, how belonging is used as a resource, but also how belonging is affected by security making or doing security. So that's my research. Now, we need to take a digression here, and that's the topic of my today's presentation, because we first need to ask what it is those security practices, right? We know what is practices, right? But what is security? So luckily, I'm not the first to ask this question, as there is a whole discipline of security studies, which emerged in the period around the Second World War and quickly became dominated by the discipline of international relations, which is a discipline which was sort of tasked with solving problems related to foreign affairs. So there was a very close link between the government, mostly the United States government, and international relations. So it followed that security at the time was predominantly about the survival of the state, because it is the state what protects the lives of people, right? Or that was the idea. And so the question of what security is was therefore largely settled. So security is the survival of the state. And researched and focused on dealing with threats to security. That is mostly militaries of other states, right? So with minor exceptions, such as peace studies, which were very popular in Scandinavia, this view went largely unchallenged until late 1980s, when social constructivist and post-structuralist approaches started kind of seeping into this discipline. Now, I will grossly simplify things now, but the idea of social constructivism and post-structuralism is that there is nothing like an external objective social reality. This means that the social reality is a product of our social interactions, and that includes security. So there is no objective security. So this obviously led to a problematization of the concept, because it is contingent, right? Which means it could be otherwise. And so we need to ask why it is the way it is. Why do we focus on the state so much? Why military threats only? And who benefits from this constellation, right? So the critical turn, which became a sort of European mainstream, largely focuses on three questions. First, what is security? Which means whose security do we mean? Whose interests it represents? What are the threats and how the threats are constructed, right? The second question, what does security do? What political consequences do discourses and practices of security bring, and also societal consequences? And the third question, what should security be or do? Now, not each critical contribution pays equal attention to each of these questions, and they also take different approaches and provide different answers. So instead of one critical approach, we have got several schools or streams of thought, which could be divided into two larger groups, which represent a sort of rift in critical security studies or schism. So some scholars talk about these two groups in terms of negative and positive security, but I think labels deconstructive and reconstructive, which I borrowed from Simon Tulumello, actually describe better what they do. So on one hand, we have deconstructive approaches, which mainly focus on problematizing security discourses and practices of states. They see security as a suspicious concept in a way, which serves as a tool of undemocratic and illiberal governance because its language of urgency, we need to, cope with threats and dangers, sort of prohibits discussion and also sometimes limits rights, right? Moreover, security in this view is seen as inherently exclusionary. It inevitably creates dangerous others who need to be tackled. And some argue that security and insecurity are actually not opposites, but two parts of the same whole, or two sides of one coin, right? So the fact that certain practices are called security rather than violence is just an outcome of certain distribution of power in this field of so-called professional managers of unease. So these deconstructive approaches usually see security as a negative thing, sometimes a very negative thing. Then there are, on the other hand, reconstructive approaches. These also pay attention to all those constellations of power, but while the deconstructive approaches focus mostly on the first two critical questions, that is what security is and what security do, the reconstructive perspectives ask what security is and what it should be or could be, right? So they try to formulate their own alternative conceptions of security, which they then use in the critical investigations of various contexts. So, for instance, Ken Booth, the author of probably the most influential reconstructive account, understands security as emancipation of human individuals. He argues that security is not mere survival, but so-called survivor plus, where the plus is, and now I quote, some freedom from life-determining threats and therefore space to make choices. He uses the example of prisoners in Nazi concentration camps who sometimes were surviving, but you couldn't really talk about security, right? Because the plus was missing there. They were not secure, even if they survived. So reconstructive approaches see security as a positive thing. Now, the problem is that none of these approaches is particularly helpful if we want to study the various forms of security that security takes in different contexts, right? Because even though they recognize this contingent nature of security, right, that security is socially constructed, it can be anything, both the deconstructive and reconstructive approaches share a sort of tendency to work with some sort of universal fixed logic. So in case of the deconstructive approaches, it is the view that security is violent and exclusionary. It's always like that. The reconstructive approaches, on the other hand, try to come up with some sort of positive, universally applicable formulation. Security is emancipation. It's always like that. So none of them really pays attention to forms of security existing outside their own conceptualizations. On top of that, they mostly choose on top, they mostly focus on their research with sort of top-down perspective, right? Which kind of denies individuals their agency in conceptualizing and practicing security. So they also neglect individuals as experts on their own lives, in the sense that you know what is security in your life. You know it best because it's your life, right? So despite this kind of declared attention to ordinary people, they actually never ask how the people themselves think about or practice security. So going back to the first critical question, that is, what is security? We know a lot about what security is in discourses and practices of state agents and elites, as well as what scholars think security is. And I should say mostly Western states and Western scholars. But there is a vast, mostly unexplored area outside these circles. So we need an approach which appreciates that security is a different thing in different places and at different times. As you could see, that is not a matter, of course, with these approaches. Second, if we want to understand what security is, we can't focus on elite discourses only, because everyone does security, right? And following Miranda's Fricker theory of epistemic injustice, it is also fair to assume that especially perspectives of socially marginalized people are missing from what is so-called generally known about security, because those views are underrepresented in the society. Third, we need to take the desire for security seriously. The deconstructive suspicion is very hard to justify when talking with people who actually face danger in their everyday lives. Security is not just a sham, because life without security is a miserable life, right? But at the same time, we must not lose this critical edge, because the security argument is sometimes used to curtail our rights, by politicians and states. And even the well-intentioned attempts to enhance someone's security may have quite negative consequences for other people. So let me now move to some of the contributions which actually took this contextualist path. This interest in the contextual study is often traced back to an article by the Danish anthropologist Niels Bubandt, who extended the anthropological observation that global modernity is always site-specific to security. Simply put, it means that he was interested in how the notion of security changes as it moves from the global to the national, from the national to the local, and so on. He was interested in the shifts that security undergoes as it moves between different contexts. Throughout the years, several strands of contextualist research emerged. Each of them took Bubandt's idea in a slightly different direction. They also used different sources of inspiration. And we can identify, let's say, 4 different trends or emphases. So first, in the top left, are approaches which ask what alternative discourses there are. For instance, Jarvis and Lister conducted focus groups with British citizens to find out how they, British citizens, understand security, and identified several images ranging from security as survival, security as belonging, security as hospitality. I think there were 6 or 8 in total. Second, bottom left, is probably the most similar to Bubandt, and it asks whether the citizen conceptions of security reproduce or challenge the ones produced or offered by the government. Third, bottom right, is the one which is probably the most distant from Bubandt, as it originated in criminology. And it explores how people experience and cope with security governance and how they cope with danger on their own when the government or when the state is not there or the agents of state are not there. And finally, the fourth group, the Pride, asks how people imagine and practice security. Now, we could also divide these approaches into other 4 groups or other 4 categories. So the ones on the left investigate discourses, while the ones on the right focus on practices. And then the ones on the top explore alternatives, and the ones on the bottom kind of investigate is top-down and bottom-up interactions, challenges, and so on. And we could also look at their methodological approaches, but I don't think I have time for that now. So I think it is clear that the top right group fits the purposes of my study the most, as I'm interested in security practices and how they interview with belonging. So I will turn there. So von Bemken and his colleagues proposed studying security as security scapes. The concept of scapes comes from work of the anthropologist Arjun Appadurai, and they understand scapes as comprising 2 parts, the cognitive part or the imaginations, and then practices which follow these imaginations. So the imaginations play a role of sort of maps, right? So security scapes, and this is their definition, are everyday practices that become constituted by imaginations of existential danger. It is very important to note that there is a multiplicity of these security scapes, both vertically and horizontally. So the vertical axis is the one that Buband talked about, right? That is the different scales, national, global, local, and so on. But then there is also a horizontal scale or horizontal level, which means that there can be multiple security scapes existing on the same scale in the nation, in the group, but also even in one person, right? So one person can subscribe to different security scapes and move between them. They showcased this framework in their study of two marginalized groups in Kyrgyzstan, Luli people, which is an ethnic minority, and queer people. I won't go into details, but they identified two sets of these security practices or security scapes. So the first set is based on confrontation. That is, for instance, when people directly confronted the perceived source of danger to enhance their security. The other was about avoidance, which means trying not to look different, for instance, creating separate safe spaces, and so on. Now, I think this is a very solid entry point into this contextualist study of security, and I like it a lot, but there are a few weak points too. First, it asks for investigations of imaginations and practices. But in fact, they don't really pay much attention to the former, to the imaginations, because they decided to analytically limit the focus to imaginations of existential danger. This means that they don't ask people how they imagine security. They ask them how they imagine existential danger. And that already is a very particular idea of security, right? One which is based on the absence of danger. Their concern is, the reason they did this, and this is a concern of many scholars, is that leaving security conceptually open would mean losing some sort of analytical clarity, because security then could mean anything, and it would be difficult to compare those practices across contexts and so on. And this does make sense, but it's a problem if the breadth of the meanings, if the variance of the meanings is what we are interested in, right? So in my master's dissertation, I conducted a short ethnographic study of meanings and practices of security among queer Georgians. That is a very similar group, queer Kyrgyz people, queer Georgians. I used an approach similar to theirs, but I decided to take a step back and ask how they, that is queer Georgians, understand security. And so you can see the difference, right? I identified 3 security scapes. Each is based on a completely different meaning of security. So security as survival, security as belonging, security as being oneself. The security scapes from Bemken and his team identified would probably be in my first category, that is security as survival. Then another question is, and that's my second point, is to what extent this security scapes approach is still critical? Because we probably want to be critical, right? It asks what security is, but it doesn't really address the other 2 questions, what security does and what security should be, right? So I think we need to open the concept of security and also move the framework closer to those critical approaches. So let me finally move to my proposal. In what I propose, I follow up on this contextualist critique and contextualist approaches, but I bring in 2 new twists. First, I will argue for studying security as a quality of things, which will bring us close to valuation studies. And second, I will take a material semiotic turn. So in contrast to von Bemken and his colleagues, I approach security as conceptually open, which, as Felix Suter pointed out, means that security in principle could mean anything. But as he also pointed out, it usually does not mean anything when you ask people, right? When it's studied in the context. So we don't actually have to worry that the concept would become too broad or too just useless. That, however, I think does not prevent us from deciding what security is at the most general level. I think when we take all those various definitions of security that are out there, such as security as a freedom from threats, security as emancipation, security as cognitive control, which is so-called ontological security, they mostly refer to a certain quality. After all, there always is some sort of referent object, right? The object which is made secure, so secure state, secure life. So it's a quality of the object, right? So I wonder if we could not study security as valuation. So if Hertz and Moore ask, what is a good tomato? Perhaps we could ask, what is a secure state or secure life or secure ecosystem, right? Now, Hertz and Moore approached various people with this question. They approached farmers, cooks, shopkeepers, customers, and they found out that tomatoes are valued in multiple registers. Some people would say that good tomato tastes and looks good. That would be central register. Others would say that good tomato is cheap. That is a monetary register. Others say that good tomato is firm when you want to make a salad, or not firm when you don't want to make a salad, and so on. And what is important is that these registers may enter various relations with each other. They can contradict each other, they can support each other, they can be kind of subsumed in one another, and so on. Now, it is important to note that valuation is also performative. It is not just a judgment upon an external object or after the object. It is also making the object good, which involves, this making good involves tinkering and care, right? You try to prepare the tomato well when you make a salad, or you try to grow it well, you tend to it, right? If you are a farmer. And this rarely means that you can actually take control over the object, because the object is to an extent external to you, right? So what if we asked, what is a secure life? In principle, I see those registers that Hertz and Moore talk about and security scapes as almost equal. They both refer to some sort of those, those cognitive maps, also values behind them, and so on. But there are also two important differences. First is that securing or doing security is not only coping with existential threats. Rather, it is a betterment. It is an attempt to achieve this desire, the desired quality, right? Which is the security in our case. But second, this betterment does not automatically imply positive outcomes, positive in the sense of positively valued. Because, for instance, cleaning can lead to sterile, which is probably not what you want to achieve when you clean your living room, right? And so the same is true for security. Intrusive surveillance can be outcome too, right? Which is probably not what we want to achieve when we want to secure our cities, right? Now, Hertz and Moore are using a material semiotic approach, which posits that things are the way they are because of the relations they enter with one another. Things and material in material semiotics is broadly conceived here. It can mean material objects, but also humans, animals, discourses, and so on. And I think this material semiotic approach is also useful for the contextual study of security, and for three reasons. So first, it sees reality as performed and multiple, which means that different constellations produce different versions of reality. So whether a street is safe or not is not necessarily a matter of different perception or interpretation of the same reality. Rather, it depends on what is involved in the enactment of the reality. So in less abstract terms, street may be both safe and unsafe, depending on what is your gender expression, right? That's not a matter of interpretation. That's a different version of reality. So securing or doing security then means tinkering with those constellations, adding, subtracting, or changing elements in those constellations so that reality gets enacted in the desired way, in a different way. So, for instance, in the case of the street, bringing along a big dog, that's adding an element, so the reality plays out differently, or trying to tackle the roots of the danger by educating the society, right? And this also means that we can't study security out of the context because it just wouldn't make sense, right? Second, material semiotics, and especially the Latourian actor network theory, which is a kind of a material semiotic approach, encourages us to follow those constitutive relations. Latour says that we have to lay continuous connections leading from one local interaction to the other places, times, agencies, through which a local site is made to do something. But we can also turn it around, right? How is the local site doing something to other places? What doing security on a street does to other places or times and so on, right? This is important because, as Foucault said, people often know what and why they do what they do, but they don't know what they do does, what the consequences of their doings are somewhere in other contexts, right? So this is an opportunity to get critical, right, in the manner of those deconstructive critical approaches, because we can trace empirically all those consequences of doing security beyond the immediate context, right? And this is also where my main research question comes in, right? What does security do to belonging? Now, and this is the third final point, if we combine the previous 2 points, we get to the ethical dimension, or the third critical question, right? What security should be. If different constellations lead to different outcomes, and we can tinker with those constellations, we can also choose which reality or which version of reality to enact, right? That is what Anne-Marie Moll calls ontological politics. Of course, the choice is sometimes limited. We don't always have freedom to choose whatever we like, but the choice is there. And so we as scholars have an option to tinker with security and reassemble it in a way which produce more ethically acceptable outcomes. We don't need to say that security is always bad, because we can make security differently. So to sum up, security is a quality of things performed in multiple registers, and doing security or securing is effort to achieve this quality. This way, we move the contextual variance to the very center of the focus. This also means that there is no limitation in terms of subjects of security. I'm designing this framework with queer people in mind, but in principle, it could be applied even to elites and to the international dimension. We could ask, what is a secure region, right? Second, I think this framework achieves what the deconstructive approaches aim at without dismissing the validity of the desire for security. We probably really want to feel secure in our cities, but that indeed may lead to very scary consequences. And finally, we preserve the contingent nature of security, which also enables us to enact it differently. We can play with those registers as well with the ways we tinker with our constellations. Thank you. That is all.